Is the priestly fraternity of St. Peter heretical? Okay, so I've been making the past few days some videos on various positions within traditional Catholicism. And in case you haven't picked up my line of thinking yet, I am very much a pantrad. SSPX is Catholic. I think Seeds of Sedevacantists are Catholic, and yeah, I think Fraternity of St. Peter is Catholic. Now, I will say this. I think the Fraternity of St. Peter has the most dangerous position of all these groups. Hands down, to the point where I do not recommend people to go to their masses and go with either SSPXers or even Sedevacantists or Eastern Catholics, rather than the priestly Fraternity of St. Peter. Yet, yes, this is a video where I'm actually going to defend their status as Catholics faithful to tradition. And that as such, unless there's some other funny business going on, you should not treat a priest of the Fraternity of St. Peter or one of the parishioners, and then yes, I'm talking to certain hardline Sedevacantists and hardline SSPXers here, you should not treat them like they're heretics simply for their position of how to handle the crisis in the church alone. Now, why am I defending the Fraternity of St. Peter, even though I clearly oppose them so much? Well, I think that we as Catholics today do not have the authority to add to the deposit of faith. And that the exact question of how to handle a crisis such as we are living in now in the church has never been infallibly defined. And that you can legitimately, based on pre-Vatican II texts, come to different conclusions. This does not mean that they are all correct or that all are equally safe. That being said, if you want to call someone a schismatic or a heretic, that is a serious accusation. And I do not think, despite how much I disagree with the Fraternity of St. Peter, and again I'm going to mention at the start of this why my problems with them first, just because I disagree with them does not make them automatically heretics. So, for starters, let's talk about my issues with the Fraternity of St. Peter and my main concerns with them. So, I have met many supporters of the Fraternity of St. Peter, as well as some diocesan TLM priests and fraternity priests who blatantly do not hold the Catholic faith. The Fraternity of St. Peter's position, as it is well known, is you always submit and obey to the Roman See Peter. That is the normative response throughout the history of the Church. That is normally what you indeed do, and there have been saints who've been canonized for it, just as there are saints who've been canonized because under unique circumstances, there have been times where you needed to disobey, so they are not heretics. So they are not heretics as such. They're not heretics as such for that position. That being said, many of them become so obsessed with obedience that obedience takes the place of faith, and they do fall into heresy. I've spoken with priests of Fraternity of St. Peter who openly say that it is a legitimate change in church teaching to no longer believe, and outside the church there is no salvation, or else in practice use legalistic reasoning to reduce it to, in practical terms, nothing. I know them who praise Vatican II and its ecumenism. I remember one Fraternity of St. Peter priest who told me, why business is it of yours? Who cares if they're blessing same-sex couples inside Catholic churches? It doesn't affect you. That is a thinking, and I hope everyone watching is quite aware of why those attitudes and those quotes are not just problematic, but blatantly heretical. Fiducia Supplicans endorse the blessing of illicit relationships, which even as recently as Pope Benedict XVI, never mind pre-Vatican II, would have been gotten you labeled as a heretic in most Catholic churches. And everyone would have recognized that you were trying to push for a radical shift in Catholic teaching, even if it's a simple blessing to live in that state. If ecumenism was condemned in Mortalem Animos by Pius XI, outside the Catholic Church, there's no salvation, was dogmatically defined. And yes, they talk about, yes, for the record, the context of that, framework says, it was clarified so that, Protestants are really separated brethren. Yeah, they were pretty explicit. If you're a heretic or a schismatic, you're outside the church, you have no eternal life unless you're joined to the church, period. It doesn't matter how much you love Jesus Christ or how good of a person you are. That is the Council of Florence. That is the context of the papal Unum Sanctum dealing with the Orthodox, who are far closer doctrinally to Catholics than Protestants. That is the context of Exsurge Domini. If you're not a big C Catholic or have solid plans at least in your heart to convert, you have no salvation. Period. Full stop. And invincible ignorance, syllabus of errors, which apparently a fraternity of St. Peter people who go this extreme route, defending all the errors of Vatican II, they say, oh, it's not dogmatic. Yet at the same time, we have to obey. They say you have to radically obey the Pope, even if it's not being infallible. Yet the minute Pius IX has a teaching that contradicts their narrative, suddenly they very quickly adopt recognize but resist. Is what I found. If in here and now it becomes inconvenient to their logic and rhetoric. Syllabus of Errors said that we cannot presume and have good faith upon the salvation of those who die outside the visible Catholic Church. That has been condemned in the Syllabus of Errors. Period. Full stop. Yes, other popes talked about invincible ignorance, but it is invincible, not culpable, and we cannot presume upon it. That is Catholic teaching. So that is my biggest problem with the priest fraternity of St. Peter. It is also, I know this from here dealing with the fraternity of St. Peter crowd, they will not publicly own themselves as Catholics' faithful tradition, as lovers of the Latin Mass, because of Traditione Custodes. They're afraid of losing the Latin Masses that they have. Essentially, the fraternity of St. Peter and other indult groups are being used to muzzle traditional Catholics, and the true faith. That is the main danger, and that is the main problem with it. And by supporting that apostolate, you are enabling such behavior, you're enabling such abuse, spiritual abuse and cowardice towards Catholics' faithful tradition, which is why I cannot support it. The faith needs to take precedence. If you have to choose between faith and obedience and sharing the true faith, the faith comes first. I'm sorry. The Pope is the vicar of Christ, but Jesus Christ is Christ. And I've already mentioned this in other videos before. St. Maximus the Confessor, famous for defending the papacy, but the context of his defense of his papacy was he was on trial for disobeying said Pope. That was his trial transcripts. He had disobeyed one of the encyclicals of Pope Honorius and preached against Monothelitism, essentially like disobeying Traditione Custodes, and preached against it. And he was declared a saint for it. That is a safe route. That is the route that David took, recognized but resist King Saul. And Jonathan, who loved David but still obeyed Saul to the end, even though he knew it was dangerous, got Jonathan killed. I always compare fraternity of St. Peter to Jonathan. They have the true faith. They love those who are fighting for it, even those who have to flee. And many even support them, but by following them endlessly, they follow their leaders right to Gilboa, and they get themselves and those who love and care about killed. I know of so many supposed track-casts whose kids are now embracing ecumenism and false doctrine, false heresy, which is what Traditione Custodes is about. They don't want Catholic tradition as a doctrinal system to continue. They don't want it to continue as a liturgical system. And that is the result. That is the fruits of it. By the fruits you shall know them, and that is the great danger of fraternity of St. Peter. That being said, this is primarily better to argue that, yes, you can be Catholic and faithful to tradition and a member of fraternity of St. Peter. Even presuming SSPXers and or seeds are correct. So for starters, as I mentioned before, there is precedent for doing the recognize and resist position. So recognizing a pope, even though he may be out to lunch and thinking he could be valid, there is precedent for that, as was the case with Pope Honorius, as the case with John the 22nd, who was supposed to have denied that people received the beatific vision until the end of the world, which was his teaching, which he later had to retract. So it is technically possible. Now, the above examples of tradcasts, especially those who are teaching false doctrine and false dogma, they are unsaved. Not because they are supporters of the priest fraternity of St. Peter, but because they do not have the true Catholic faith. And I don't care, especially if you deny the Catholic faith publicly, I don't care if technically it results in you losing your status in the church or not. That's another whole other debate, but you're simply unsaved. You cannot have eternal life. Now, that being said, I've actually on my YouTube channel, members of the fraternity of St. Peter, they call out these heresies for what they are, heresies. There is not enough money in the world to pay them. They all think that Novus Ordo should be abolished, and they will say so if you ask them. And some of them attend the Novus Ordo because they think, it's an abuse of liturgy, but it's better than nothing. And they think that the fraternity of St. Peter and fighting the modernism of the church within the mainline structure is the best way to handle things. That is their position. That is not a heretical position. And in most cases, if the heresies of the Second Vatican Council and modernism were not so rampant as they are, I really had to tell people, like St. Pius X literally said, changing dogma and doctrine is the very definition of the modernist heresy. And they don't believe me, and whenever I bring that up, they say, "Oh, you're not a priest, therefore it doesn't matter." And if I was a priest, they would report me to my bishop. Essentially, they want to believe in their heresies and their lies, so they give themselves over to a lie. That being said, there are Catholic faithful Christians who hold the true faith, or else they don't know for some reason, and there are people who are just ignorant or isolated, don't know what's going on. For example, I knew of someone, I asked him what he thought about the scandal of Fiducia Supplicans. He had no idea what Fiducia Supplicans even was. Such people can't have salvation. Such people are not just part of the mystical body of Christ by desire or attached to it, they are in the Big C Catholic Church, full stop. Why do I know this? Well, let's turn to another case of precedent. I would turn to the history of the Venerable Bede. Famously, it records history of the English people and their conversion in the early Middle Ages. And one of the accounts in there is of a letter written by a Catholic saint who was canonized by the Church to the Pope. And they're corresponding with the Pope, and the Pope is very interested in what's going on, how to evangelize the English, bring them to the true faith. Guess who that Pope was? Pope Honorius I, the exact same Pope who was opposed by St. Maximus the Confessor for enabling heresy, and who to this day remains the only Pope who's been anathematized by the Catholic Church. He took the advice from the St. Peter, and he evangelized according to it. Later on, the people in England found out there was actually this controversy going on in the church. And once they found out, they investigated everyone, all the clergy, all the laity, and when they were happily good. The Monothelite heresy is no longer here. Good. The Monothelite heresy and they rejected it. So this shows the kind of fraternity of St. Peter you can have. Yes, they're institutionalized to a bishop or pope who is kind of wacky. You can have ones who are ignorant. And some of them are trying to legitimately fight within the mainline Big C Catholic Church. Because the question is, okay, at what point does the cancer abuse in the church become so bad it becomes a schism? That's a fair discussion point. And they fight for it. They fight for the faith. They are part of the Big C Church. They hold the true faith. Again, forgive me if I'm stumbling, and I'm making this video off the cuff. The question is, okay, but you can maybe still have some Anglicans in the Anglican Church doing that. The question is, and it's a worthwhile one often abused, too far in my opinion, by those who defend the Trinity of St. Peter, but it is a valid question nonetheless. What point do you say that it's become so heretical that it is no longer the Catholic Church. So, there have always been heresies in the Church. So, for example, at what point do the people who live in the Diocese of Canterbury have an obligation to stay away from Mass? Thomas Cranmer probably early on was a heretic very early on. He was probably saying things early on. You disobey right away? Does that mean all the priests in the diocese and all the parishes are automatically heretical? Does that mean, at what point does it actually happen? Now, this cannot be reduced to the point of being foolish. Otherwise, there's still going to be people in the Anglican Church today who are waiting for the Pope's letter of condemnation to be read from their pulpit. And the Anglican Church by their leftist women feminist pastor. Well, it has been read from my parish pulpit today. I know it's been 500 years, but I've heard rumors in the grapevine that 500 years ago was excommunicated. But the female pastor who doesn't believe in Jesus hasn't read the decree of the Pope's condemnation of Thomas Cranmer from the pulpit. I heard it from the grapevine else, but it's not been officially read to me. Therefore, I guess I'll have to go along with it. That is essential. You will eventually get people with that extreme position. And indeed, I brought this up to a family. She said, can't go to SSPX because I remember chatting with the Fraternity of St. Peter woman. She said she wasn't going to go to SSPX because she wants to fight for her Catholic parish. So I asked her, said, okay, are they teaching the Catholic faith from the pulpit in this parish? Is the priest doing it? She said, oh no, it's very heretical. Okay, about the laity there, is there a majority plurality of people who at least believe the bare minimum of the Catholic faith? She said, oh no, they know the Catholic faith and they reject it. It's okay, maybe the liturgy at least is at least Catholic. Oh no, it's fully modernist and heavily Protestantized, you wouldn't recognize it. Well, at least maybe it's an old building. No, it's built 5-6 years ago. So I said to her, okay, I have a question for you. They're not teaching the Catholic faith from the pulpit. The laity do not hold the Catholic faith and openly, knowingly reject it, which is heresy. By the way, you can check Canon 1364 in the new Code of Canon Law. If you are a heretic, you are automatically excommunicated from the Catholic Church. Lay people don't believe in it. They're not doing Catholic liturgy or sacraments, and it's heavily Protestantized to reflect their heretical views. And the parish building isn't even that old of a building. The building was never been used for anything except this heretical worship. I asked her, okay, at what point, in what sense is your Catholic community and Catholic parish a Catholic? In what sense? Well, they believe in the papacy and stuff like that. Well, yeah, so does SSPX. Why don't you just go there then? They believe, if that's all it takes. SSPX is on pretty solid grounds then, if that's the situation. Look, we are called to love the Catholic faith. We are called to do all these things. That being said, in spite of these extremes, it's a fair question. The Pope Bishop of the diocese is a heretic, but I go to a Latin Mass parish where the priest preaches the Catholic faith with fire and brimstone. It's the Catholic liturgy, the sacraments are valid, and the laity are on fire. They hold the true faith. They're even more solid than some SPXers. What about a situation like that? Or heresies rampant in my diocese. But my bishop, he secretly even goes to SSPX for confessions. He privately will only say the TLM, and he's trying to nudge everyone to obey bad liturgy. He believes EENS and all these other dogmas. Or my priest, he celebrates the Novus Ordo, but he believes in EENS, condemns ecumenism, etc., 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 and thinks Vatican II is garbage. Or if it is valid, its entire interpretation is completely heretical. What about situations like those? And that is a fair question that a Fraternity of St. Peter person would ask, and it is a good philosophical question for all trads of all brands, Fraternity of St. Peter, SSPX, and Sedevacantist, to ask. What point does, even without a decree, your diocese, your parish, your conference, your whole situation go from being Catholic to non-Catholic? And you never get a chance to hear a decree. At what point does that come? Should a simple priest forgets to say, mispronounces the word of the last gospel and he's a heretic? Do you really want to wait for the priest to start doing a black mass praising the devil before he calls him heresy? Or are you still going to say even then, can't wait, it's so hard, I haven't been told yet, I should just be obedient? These are extreme situations, but on both extremes, in the mainline Big C Catholic Church, you have both extremes going on in some places. In some cases, in many cases, that is absolutely the situation. In many places, it's the Fraternity of St. Peter, and they're solid. In many places, they do have good bishops. That being said, it is a serious question that everyone needs to ask themselves, and anyone who thinks that it's clear-cut is kidding themselves. Modernism is the heresy of gray, and we Tradcasts like doing everything in black and white. I remember a story from my childhood. I remember I wanted to make this model of the Statue of Liberty. I first saw a picture of it on TV, so I wanted to make it with the color gray, with gray clay. We didn't have any, so I took some Play-Doh in class that was white, some that was black, and mushed it together, made gray. I was then told I wasn't supposed to do that, so I tried to pull the white and black apart from the gray, and I realized I couldn't do it. There's no way I could, and that is the issue with us Tradcasts and our bickering. Most of the arguments with us as Catholics, faithful tradition, are how to deal with the mainline Big C Catholic Church, how to understand it, how to handle it in practical and theological terms. Modernism is the heresy of gray. By its very definition, it is the belief of evolving dogmas and evolving situations. So trying to pin it down is simply not going to happen. Yeah, there's some very blatant cases where it's clearly heretical, like puppet masses. Some cases, not so much. Hans Kung was tradition. You can have like a very conservative, like those Fraternity of St. Peter priests who I mentioned. It's being both heresy. Or priests who are in situations where they might legitimately be poorly educated, though honestly, if you've been through a seminary, I'm sorry, you have an obligation to know. And we should operate in presumption that you are properly educated, because you have that obligation. And especially if you go on about how you've studied 7 years. You studied theology and apologetics for 7 years. Sorry, that's the case. But yeah, there is precedent for, if you're isolated, don't know what's going on in your own little parish world, and you reject these heresies doctrinally in practical terms, then yes, you are part of the Big C Catholic Church, even if everything else is going crazy around you. You're still a Catholic parish, to the best of your knowledge. Though it's not a position I think is likely or correct myself, it is a fair question. Even though I think it is a dangerous situation, and you're putting yourself in harm's way of losing everything, having the sacraments and Catholic orthodoxy pull out from under the rug, and I've seen this even with well-meaning trads who go to SSPX, who try so hard to defend the heresies of a pope that they try to be so obedient that they start making compromises in the faith to hold it. I remember one Fraternity of St. Peter man I met tried to argue, no, Francis is the pope, but he has to be removed first, canonically. Yes, he said heresy, but he's still a pope unless he's canonically removed. First of all, you cannot remove a valid pope. That is literally heresy, the heresy of conciliarism, and the removal of a heretical pope operates on the presumption that he's already lost his office. So that is one danger of the Fraternity of St. Peter is, and to a certain degree, even SSPX. Again, I endorse SSPX in every video, and they are correct, but it is something that if you go that route theologically or in practical terms, you need to watch yourself for that. Just as I think I think SSPXers should not presume that everyone who goes there to a fraternity chapel, or certainly not an SSPX chapel, holds that position, or is even thinks about it that much. And most of us are just trying to live the Catholic faith. So, based on the history of Bede and the fact that in England, even during the Monofleet crisis, the fact that the bishops there were still operating in contact with with Pope Honorius, yes, I think you can be a Fraternity of St. Peter Catholic, based on that precedent. Again, if you disagree with me, if you think if you're an FSSP supporter and disagree with me, or an SSPX supporter, or a Sedevacantist contest, please comment your disagreements down below. I'm happy to hear from everyone on these videos. I'm hoping I'm not misrepresenting anyone. Most of these recent videos are off the cuff, but I want to make sure that everyone's position is being accurately represented. Anyway, God bless. If you have a chance in real life, please check out SSPX Church. God bless. Have a great day.